Hi guys, this is Mike Hibbert back with another Python Django tutorial, and this time we're going to look at the issues involved in deploying Django applications onto EC2. Now, we previously in the free tutorials covered how to deploy to Heroku, which is vastly simplified, and a lot of you asked for an EC2 how-to or a guide through to that, and unfortunately it's not a very simple affair and it's quite a learning curve, but I'm hoping that in this video I can give you the beginnings of an understanding of how to actually go about setting this all up, and then from that you should be able to take the principles away from this and apply it to your own projects. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up an instance on EC2, and this tutorial basically assumes that you already know how to actually access the Amazon Web Services and that you can get into the EC2 dashboard, which is what you can see on the screen here. Okay, so first of all we want to click on the instances section and then launch an instance. And in here you should be presented with a list of Linux boxes that you can then commission, or Windows boxes if you really must. I advise you to use a Linux box because it's far more secure and reliable, and in terms of web services and that sort of thing, I wouldn't trust a Windows box as far as you could throw it. That being said, that's my opinion, and some of you might argue that that's not true. In my experience, I've always had far more reliability out of Linux boxes, and therefore less hard work in my job. So the instance we're going to pick is this one here, the Ubuntu server 13.10, and you can choose a 64 or a 32-bit one. Doesn't really matter, unless you're definitely set on having one or the other. For the purposes of this tutorial, you don't really need to have much of a choice there. So I would just pick whatever you fancy. It doesn't really matter too much. In the case of me, I picked the 32-bit version, and then clicked select. Then it basically asks you for a few little pieces of information like size. T1 micro is the one I picked. Up to 2 ECUs. Memory's not too important because we're just going to serve a basic web app, and that's pretty much it. If you just go through the sections, then you should be able to answer all these questions just by more or less just clicking the next button. I never actually picked any custom options here. I always picked the defaults, and that's all you need to do. Once you've done that, you should have an instance running here, and that's my instance there. T1 micro version of this Linux box. Now the next step in there is to basically go through and go to our elastic IPs, and you need to allocate a new address, and when you allocate it you will select EC2, and then you will then click on here, and under the options, if I did it correctly, which I might not have done. Yes. If we right click on the new IP address, we need to associate the address with a box. And then it will go through and see what instances you've already got running in your instances section and say which one do you want. And this is my only instance at the minute, so we'd select that one and associate that. And that basically gives the box an outward facing IP address. I'm just going to release that because I've already got my IP address associated there. So that's the EC2 side of things inside there. The only other thing we need now is to check on the security groups. Now the reason for that is because by default the firewalling is actually switched off. So you more or less can't serve information in or out through an SSH port or through anything really, or even by web server. So what you need to do then is to basically go in, and most of you will click on the default one here. You probably won't see these because these are ones I've set up in the past. But you'll click on the default, and on the inbound tab here, you should then see in this list on the right hand side, SSH and HTTP are missing for you. That basically means you're going to have to add in the rule that says that SSH and HTTP is allowed. And the way that you do that is just basically select it from the list in this create new rule option, select HTTP, leave that as 000/0 and just click add rule. And then finally, once you've added those two new rules in, click the apply rule changes here. And then that should apply that for you. If you find that you've got more than one in here, because you've already messed around with it in the past, then you may find that the instance that you're running over here may be applying to one of these ones. So I found personally that this one was the thing that was actually affecting my instance. So for a while, whilst I was preparing for this tutorial, I found that I couldn't actually get any HTTP traffic out of it, so I couldn't visit the place as a website. And as a result, I had to come into this particular profile and add these two rules here, as you can see. So just have a quick look around and see if you can see which one's applying to which. It shouldn't be too hard. And then just make sure that those two ports are open on the firewall, and you should be good to go. And that's your EC2 instance prepared. Okay. So the next part is to basically make sure that you download your key pairs. Now, in the key pairs section, you'll see there that we can create key pairs, and I've created a pair for my laptop so that I can access this. Basically, you click create key pair, it'll ask you a few questions, then it'll offer you to download a PEM file, a PEM file, and I advise you to keep that safe and potentially, keep it in some kind of encrypted area, because that will contain your access keys, so that when you finally come through to this Ubuntu box, this instance here, then you will basically use that PEM file as your substitute key, so that you can authenticate yourself. So download that, and then the next step is for us to actually go and log into the box. I'm just going to pause this while I prepare for that next stage. Okay, so now that we've actually allocated the IP address and associated with our running instance inside of the EC2 system, we're going to actually log onto the box so that we can actually set up the server. Now, to log onto the box, we're basically going to use SSH. Now, like I said before, we use this PEM file that we've downloaded, and we used the -i command line option just to say to use this particular authentication file. And we're going to log on to the IP address that we got inside of our EC2 section. So if we go into Elastic IPs, this is the IP address here, and as you can see in here, all I've done is say Ubuntu, which is the user, at, and then the IP address. If we click enter there, it should do a little bit of thinking about it, and there we go. It's used our PEM file to automatically log us in and authenticate us. So you can't just log in using password authentication through this. That's impossible, and very insecure as well. So the way that we get around that is we use a proper secure key file, and that authenticates through SSH and lets us into the box. Now, that basically means that we're now logged in, and the current working directory should be, if we do pwd on the Linux box, print working directory, it gives us the home folder Ubuntu, which is the default user's home folder. Okay, so now we've got this task of actually installing some of the software. This being a brand new instance of Linux box, it doesn't by default have everything that we need to serve web pages. So we're going to just go through the task of basically installing Apache along with the mod WSGI module, so that we can then run our Django framework through the Apache modules. Now, some of you might have wanted to do this through Nginx. There are other various different web servers available, but this is the one that if you go onto the Django project's website, they say that this is the recommended way to do it. So this is more or less the way that most people would expect to do this, and as well as that, it's also kind of like an industry standard, so let's not argue with them. Okay, so the bit we need to do now is we need to actually do a bit of an update on this new box, because it won't have had its software repositories updated. So the first thing we need to do is we need to run sudo apt-get and we want to do update followed by sudo apt-get upgrade. Now what that'll do is it'll basically fire off the first command, which is this, and then by putting the semicolon on the end, we're just basically telling the console or the command line that this is a separate new command just straight after. You might have seen this kind of sort of thing when you do things like SQL, because that's how you terminate a command in SQL. Once you've done that, it should kind of go away and think about it and then install whatever needs upgrading. Once you've done that, then you're now ready to actually install the rest of the system. So to install the next bit, we want to install the Apache 2 and lib Apache 2 -mod -WSGI modules. So to do that, we want sudo apt-get install Apache 2, and then we want lib Apache 2 mod WSGI, and that'll install the Apache server, which will handle any incoming HTTP requests, and as well as that, it'll install this module which handles WSGI handling for the web server, which is compatible with our Python stuff. So once we've done that, the next step is to install a bit more of the database type of stuff, because whilst in the last tutorial you would have seen that we were doing local development in SQLite, on this side of things we're actually going to deploy into Postgres. So we need the database actually installed on here. So to install that, we've got sudo apt-get install PostgreSQL. Okay, and then we need the PostgreSQL client. We want Postgres, big sigh there. Contrib package, and we also want the Python interface, PostgreSQL, and that should be enough to support the database side of things and also do the whole interface between our Python code or our Django framework and the calls that we'll be making through our models. So once you've installed that, which should take over quite a while, then we've got the next set of software to install. So now that we've got a web server and some database support in there, we need to now put in our Python support. So the next step is basically to install the pip Python package manager. So sudo apt get install Python pip. Then we need Python dev, because we may need to compile modules when pip installs something, especially when we come to doing some of the actual modules for Postgres. We'll find that there's some extensions that actually require to be compiled, and that means that we need to put in the build essential package 2. And what that basically does is it installs the ability to compile things like C and C++ code, which is essentially what the Python modules will be under the hood, so to speak. So we'll need to compile some of those, and when we call pip to install something, some of the packages come down as source code, and that's why we compile that. Okay, so once you've installed that, the next step is to do the next thing, which is a build dependency, just to check things that are installed properly. So we've got build dep Python PSYCOPG2. That's a nice easy name to remember for you. So that will check the built-in dependencies and install anything that needs to go along with that Python support. And this is basically the extensions for our Postgres. Once that's done, when you've installed that software, then we're going to switch over to start using the pip installer, because we want to basically install the support for our Django framework and also the virtual environment stuff. Now, in the previous tutorials, you would have seen those virtual environment stuff being done locally, but we're actually going to use it on a production server as well. And this makes it ideal for when you've got several sites that maybe don't all use the same version of Django and sometimes have different version modules in there. If you still continue to use virtual env on your server, then you'll find that it's much less hassle, and you're able to support all sorts of little mix-ins that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do had you just installed Django at the base level, at the root level on this server. So with that, we'll install pip and get it to upgrade to the latest version of pip as well. So sudo pip install, and we want -- upgrade pip. That will upgrade pip. So once we've done that, we need to then start install the modules. So I'm going to do an upgrade install of virtual env on the server, and that'll basically pull down whatever the most brand new version is, and then it will install it, but then it will go and double check using virtual env's upgrade system and see if there are any more upgrades to apply to it. And that means that we'll always have the most current version of virtual env as well. Okay, so once we've done that, that should be installed, and we're getting very near to being able to actually do some actual configuration work on the web server. So we've got a few more little bits to do, and the next bit is basically to install finally that Postgres module that we're going to use. So it's PSY COP G2. Now this bit you'll probably see the compilation side of things happening, because this doesn't come down as a bog standard module. This comes down as a lump of source code, and pip will go ahead and use the build essential stuff and all of that stuff that we've just installed using apt-get to go away and build this so that you've got a specific module that's made specially for this box. So you'll have an ideal setup with that. Okay, so once that's done, we've done as much configuration as we can at this point. The next step is to really go across and have a look at setting up our local version of the application, which is basically the application that we built using built in the last tutorial. We're going to show you how that actually gets deployed onto a remote server, so that we can have, you know, those email authentication system online, and so we can see how that actually can get put into place in terms of EC2's setup. And I think probably you're already finding that the EC2 setup is not a trivial matter in comparison to when you did the Heroku tutorial. Don't worry, everyone hates this idea, but we're getting better, and if you want to look at some really good and easy setups, then Heroku is a great one. Another one is OpenShift, which is a very good setup as well. So if you're wanting easier setups with a similar kind of result, then you might want to go through that. But this tutorial is mainly by way of helping you to understand EC2's way of doing things. But at the same time, if you ever have dedicated servers, you'll also find that dedicated servers work very similar to this too. Okay, right, so the next step now is to now look at setting up our virtual hosts with Apache. Now, inside of my project, which by the way I'll be making this source code downloadable as well, so you can get your hands on this and have a look. Inside of here I've got a MyDjango app.conf file. Now, if you've never used Apache 2 before, then you probably should go away and have a look at that and learn how it works, because it really is important that you understand how web server software works if you're going to be deploying online. It's outside of the scope of this one, except that I'll give you enough information to get you through. So if we open this up in the text editor, we have a small configuration file. Now, what this basically does is it allows Apache to know that there is a website to be served on this particular web box, and it basically gives it a number of configuration options. The first being that this virtual host is available on all IP addresses, hence the star, that are associated with this box. So when we associated our Elastic IPs before, we could have had more than one IP address associated to this box, but we chose to do one. Had we had two, we could have had an incoming traffic on both of those IP addresses, and this particular part of the virtual host would have said, on any of the IP addresses associated with this, we will accept traffic in on port 80. And now HTTP traffic is port 80, so that's basically just saying if there's any visits here through a web browser, then we should then react to it in the following way. Then we have a directory declared with various sets of options, allowing permissions so that scripts can be run inside of there. If we didn't put this in, then it would basically say that there was no permission to run any of the Python code inside of our folder, and that would totally screw our website and we'd be stuck. So we basically define this folder to say this is what the permissions are for this folder. There's a server admin option which you can choose to ignore if you want. You don't necessarily have to fill it in. That's just me saying if there's a problem, send me an email to my website or to my Gmail address. The server name and server alias are important because the server name basically says what the website address is. Now, that's just the website address without any www or any subdomains on there. And the reason for that is because we want to start at the base domain, at the base level. And then we can add things like server aliases, which basically say whenever there's traffic inside coming from the internet that says, give me this website remote.mydjangoapp.com, then it will match that. Even though we know the server name is this, it will still say, okay, that's a valid access website address to come into this particular site that we've defined. We could put various other aliases in there if we wanted to, but for the purposes of what I'm doing, I'm actually using this to define a locally set up website address. Now, what do I mean by a locally set up website address? Well, if I go into ECT and look for the hosts file on my Linux box. Now, if you're on Windows, I think this is in your Windows Win32 drivers folder. I could be wrong on that one. On a Mac, I think it's exactly the same place as it is in the Linux. It's under the ECT hosts file. And inside here, what we've done is, on my local development, I've set the IP address to be the local IP address where my Django instance would run, and I've put local.mydjangoapp.com. In the case of my remote one, I've put the IP address for the Elastic IP. So I've put this IP address into there and put remote.mydjangoapp.com. Now, what will happen is if I go into the browser and I type in remote Django app, as you can see, it pushes straight through to the EC2 instance. If I do local, it goes through to my local version of Apache. So basically what I'm doing is I'm setting up my own locally based website addresses that basically help me to do development in a way that's similar to as if I was actually developing online. The only difference being that when I want to visit my local version, I use this, and when I want to visit my online version, I use that. And that's very useful during the time that you're doing your development, just to be able to switch between URLs and see the differences in your website's behavior online and offline. So I did that by editing the ECT hosts file and putting those two entries in there. So going back to our virtual host file for Apache, we've set that as a remote alias so that whenever I do that visit to the website, it will match this and say, I know that address, it's based on my box and it's part of this particular site. And as a result, it will then point any traffic through and have this Django.wsgi file executed. And then that will then trigger the Django framework to work through the mod WSGI module for Apache. So the Django.wsgi file is just here, and if we have a quick look through that, what we've done is we've just written some Python code. We have added in the site packages folder for our particular deployment, and on our folder system on the online version, we're going to be storing everything inside of email_auth. So the virtual environment will be called email_auth, and it'll have this local folder with all the site packages in. Now, the only thing that will probably change is if you use a different name for your virtual environment, this bit will probably change. The rest will probably stay the same. Then we append two paths to the Python path. so that when the Apache runs through this code, it'll look through and be able to include any modules that are inside there, and that's important so that our apps and our various pieces of code within our Django app work properly. We've got our environment setting for Django settings module, which is set to ea.settings, which basically turns out to be inside of this folder and our settings.py file. Then finally we activate our virtual environment by sending this command activate_env, and then we find the expand user folder and then find this script, and exec file basically runs that script, which then activates. So that would be the equivalent as if you had typed source bin activate, which is what you do locally when you're developing. However, when you're online and it's running through an Apache web server, it needs to be able to do that command too, and this is how it achieves the same result. By and large, you more or less cut and paste that, and the only thing, like I say, will change is probably just the place where the script is located. Then finally we use Django's core handlers for WSGI and create an application instance from the WSGI handler. This is more or less the same code over and over again, whatever website you use. So more or less you'll find that you cut and paste this, and then you change various little parts like that path, and then in the main you'll probably just leave everything else alone. So it's very much a cut and paste job, just that I'm showing you these particular options so that you have a fair idea of what they are. Okay, so that's how we have configured our web server. Going back to this config file, once it gets onto the web server, you'll need to copy it into the Apache sites enabled file. So you will have, once you've actually deployed the code onto the site, you will have inside of your ECT Apache 2 sites enabled folder. I'll just do an ls on there, shall I? Okay, so my typing's not so great today. There we go. So you will have a sites enabled folder full of a 000 default file, which is what comes bog standard with the first installation of Apache, and then you'll have a mydjangoapp.conf, which you can either copy in there or you can copy it into the sites available folder and then use A2 and site to enable it. If you're familiar with Apache's command line stuff, then that's probably a nice easy way for you to do it. Other than that, you can more or less just copy that config file from your home folder straight into there. So you would probably just do a sudo cp then mydjangoapp.conf and then through to the other folder. Okay, so that's the web server side of things set up. The next bit is basically for us to then go ahead and do the configuration for the database. Once all of this is set up and we've done the bulk of the work on this, then we can then go ahead and do the more simple part of the task, which is actually deploying the code. Believe it or not, the biggest problem is the actual setup of the box and to set up the actual web server itself with the database. Once you've done all of that, the rest is easy, so to speak, and you'll find that once you've got one box set up, you can then more or less install multiple Django applications quite simply in the normal way that you would expect to do that. So let's see if we can move on quickly and see if we can get this database set up so as to have this ready and up and running. I'm just going to pause this whilst I do a bit more configuration. Okay, so right, now that we've got everything done, then we need to now go into Postgres and set up the database. So to do that, we need to do sudo su postgres -c psql template 1. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't profess to be a bit of anything of an authority on Postgres. In my experience, it's usually good enough to know enough to be able to create a database and a user. And once you've done that, then you let Django take care of all of your migrations and database side of things. And to be fair, as a developer, that's really how it should be. I shouldn't have to be able to understand a great deal of developer ops. That sort of stuff is really restricted to system administrators and those sorts of guys who spend a lot of time and effort trying to learn that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't want to, try and learn their job on top of me trying to develop software. So when it comes to Postgres, I don't really know a great deal about it other than I know how to create a database and set up a user so that I can then get my Django project to do the rest. So here goes. This is the basics that you need to know to actually set up a user and a database so that you're ready for your Django to install. So you'll need to do sudo su postgres -c psql template 1. Okay, and that'll get you logged in to Postgres. Now, there's a number of things that we need to do. We need to alter the initial user's password so that we can actually have access to things, and then it'll make life a little easier for us to actually set up stuff. So if you've got a better way of doing this and you know Postgres better than I do, then feel free to do that, because whatever it takes to make it simple for you. I always follow this way because this is the way I was shown how to do it through many hours of Googling and all that sort of stuff. So here we go. The first thing is to alter yeah, let's type it correctly. Alter user Postgres, and with password and I'm just going to put in the password as password here, nice and secure. And then once I've done that, I do a / or backslash rather q, which exits out there. Then we've got another couple of command line things to do. So we want to do sudo password -d postgres okay, so that changes the password expiry information. Then we want sudo su postgres -c password. Whoops. So anyway, you would type in the password twice there, and that should then change that password. So then we come back and we do the same command again, where we log in to Postgres using the sudo su postgres -c psql template 1. Now that we're in here, we can actually then create our new user. So we want to create user, and in the case of mine, I'm going to configure it to be email of user with password, and I'm going to keep it simple for my purposes. Now, in your efforts to do this, you might choose to use something else. It's probably better to use something a lot more secure, but for the purposes of this tutorial, then I'm just going to keep it very simple and not add in any extra complexity. So that will create our brand new user. I'm not going to do that myself because I've already created that user, so I don't want to clobber that. The next bit is to create a database. So create a database, and I'm going to call it my Django AppDB. End that with a semicolon and press enter. That should create our database. And then finally, we need to grant all the privileges for the database so that we can actually have Django do all the schema modifications and migrations and that sort of stuff. So we want grant I can never remember whether I spelled this right. Privileges. Yeah. On database. My Django app DB to email auth user. And once you've done that, that will grant the ability to create or drop tables, change schema, that sort of thing, through to the email auth user. So that when we run our syncdb command later on, that will be able to manage all of the schema changes and stuff for us. The basics, all we need is just to create a database and to create a user that can actually do something with that database. And once we've done that, we've succeeded in that task. So we just need to do \q, and then that's everything set up. The final little bit to do is to then set up some privileges for password authentication in the Postgres database. So what we want is sudo nano. You can use Vim for this if you prefer to use Vim. I like using nano. It's far more simple in my way of thinking, and I'm not sure why, but it is. 9.1 main. We want pg hba.conf. So nano ect PostgreSQL 9.1 main pg hba. And in here, if we scroll right to the bottom, we've got a number of things that we need to alter. Now, the first thing being that this local all line will probably not end in MD5 for you. It will probably end in peer. You need to change that to MD5 because peer is not the kind of authentication we want. We want MD5 so we can type in passwords into our settings.py, and then the authentication will go off the passwords. The last thing we need to do is add this final line at the bottom, which basically says local my Django app DB user, and then a big space because we're not going to be specific about which IP address this can be come from, but then we're going to use the method as MD5 as well. And then once we've done that, we just need to save, and everything's now set up. To apply the new settings, we need to then restart Postgres. So we need to do sudo service Postgres restart, and that'll restart the database system, reloading the new changes that we've made to that config file, and then we're ready and set up for everything else to be done. So that's everything on the server side done. The next step is really to get ourselves prepared to actually deploy our code onto the server. So to do that, we first of all need to do something like create a Bitbucket or a Git repository, and this is what I've done. So I've basically set up this Git repository, then I've gone into my particular side of things, or my local side of things, sorry, and I'm now inside of my project. So inside of my project, I've got a number of files that are already there because we did development. What we haven't seen yet is this requirements.txt just here. Now, the way we generate that is we go pip freeze requirements.txt, and what that'll do is it'll get pip to output all of the currently installed modules in this virtual environment, and that'll be useful for when we get to the other side, because then we can use pip to duplicate the needed modules for this site using that requirements.txt. Okay, so to start off this, we need to do git init, and that will then initialize this as a Git repository. Then we need to then add in the GitHub repository. So to do that, we just basically follow the commands that you get inside of here, which will say add this remote host. Then finally, we'll just do a git add full stop. Actually, no, before we do that, I'll just draw your attention to something, because we have a git ignore file here, and inside of it we have 3 lines of text. One says star.pyc, one says star.db, and one says local settings.py. And what that'll do is that'll exclude any of the compiled Python that we may already have in our folders. It will exclude the development database, and it will exclude our local settings.py. And the reason for that is we don't want any of those files turning up on our production server. So by adding in this .gitignore file and putting those settings in there, we will restrict that, and things should work out nicely for us on the other side. So before we actually do the git add stuff, before we do the git add stuff, we should always create our git ignore and get that to do that. So then we've got git add period, that'll add everything. Then we want git -m commit, and then probably initial commit, and then finally git push. Now, as you're making changes, you can continue to use the git add command and the git push, commit it all up into your repository, and you'll find that it's actually quite a nice, easy way of doing it, because once you get into the habit of using it this way, when you actually come to deploy it onto the server, you'll find that only the files that have changed will be downloaded, which means a much faster update to your website code as you go. Right, so I want to really look at the settings that I'm going to change on this local site before we actually put anything on the server. So let's just run through that. So the first thing we want to do is go into the settings, and the thing you'll notice that's different from the last project or the last video is that I've changed the way that we generate our project folder. Now the reason for that is because if you use the os.get cwd or current working directory command, for some reason when it's on EC2, you get a / instead of the actual current working folder, and I think it's more or less something relating to the way that Apache accesses the files. So when it generates that path, you end up getting the root folder, and then you get permission problems. So to bypass that, what we've done is we've used another method of getting this project folder by using the directory name for the current file and then appending 2 dots on the end. And that basically gives us the folder of, if I just point it out, so it gives you this folder here, which is inside of here where the settings is, or settings are, but then by appending the 2 dots on the end, we step back 1 folder, then this generally gives you the main folder where your manage.py file will be, where all your templates or your static files will be. So by doing that, we get the same path, and we override the weird problem that we have with EC2 and the Apache thing. So by changing that to this piece of code here, we solve a lot of problems. The next change is actually the databases section. Now, as you can see, I've changed the structure in the folder just to here. I've moved out the old database settings into a local settings.py file and replaced the normal settings with the online version of the database settings. So this doesn't say SQLite anymore, it says Postgres, and it has the username, the database name, and then the username, and then the password. We leave the host port alone because we don't necessarily need that. The settings for local development are now inside of this local settings folder here, or file rather, and as you can see, it's got debug true, blah blah blah. Now it also resets a lot of the other stuff that we've changed inside of this settings file. Now how does it do that? Well, like in the previous tutorials that you've seen, right at the end of the file we try to import the local settings, and if there's an exception and it doesn't import, then we just ignore it. So in theory, because we've done the git ignore file, if I just get the settings up there, it ignores my local settings file, so that file will never make it into the Git repository, or the Bitbucket repository in my case. Therefore, these settings will always apply to online. This file here, this local settings file, will never get online and always will stay on my local machine, and that should be the way that it is anyway. As is the case, it will also never ever alter my static files stuff and never mess around with that either, which is exactly what you want to happen. So that's our database settings. The next bit is the static root is set to the project folder which we've created, plus the static folder name. Our static URL changes, and in this case, because I'm not using a normal domain name, I've chosen to put the IP address in here, and that's perfectly valid if you're just doing that in the process of setting up. What you might want to do, if you've got a website address and you want to point it to the EC2 instance, is you might want to go and change the A record on your domain name to point to that IP address, because effectively an A record just resolves through to an IP address of a machine. So you can change the A record in your domain name wherever that's hosted, and it should then after a few hours propagate and point through to there. So you could substitute that with a website address if you want to mess around with that sort of stuff. We also enabled default storage finder inside of the static file finders. Now if you look in the local settings, by default that's not on here, that's commented out, and that's the way it is from a default install of Django. So we've put that on. The other thing that we've also done is we've got our same project folder templates section, so that should then still continue to look through into these templates folder here and pull out the templates that we need. So that's the little bit of preparation that we've had to make so that it's online, or it's going to deploy nicely online, but not affect our offline development. So once we've done all of that, we can then go ahead and commit that through to our GitHub or to our Bitbucket or whatever repository you're using. Then once we've done that, we can then go online to our main web server and we can then pull that down. But before we pull it down, we need to create a virtual environment so for it to actually exist in. So again, virtual env, then we want to create the name of it, and in the case of this it's going to be email auth. Once you've created that, you can go inside the email auth and you should see the bin include lib folders and the local folder, but not the EA one. And the reason why that is because I have already installed my Django, but I'm about to show you how we install it. What we do is we go into our Bitbucket, and it'll give you a number of options of the URL to use for your git command. You want the HTTPS one, and the reason for that is because if you're going to do this securely, this will not be a shared repository or a public repository. It will have a password protection on, and you don't want people to go inside there and take code. Or maybe you do if you're an open source project, possibly. But in the case of mine, I don't want people to come in, so I'm doing it securely. And the way that we do that is we do git clone, then cut and paste in that URL that we just pasted and took off the website, and then say EA, which is the actual folder name that we're going to pull it down into. Once you've done that, if you press enter, it will attempt to check out a copy. It'll ask you for the password for your restricted access repository. Then you fill that password in and it'll pull down the code. Okay, so once that's in place, then the next step is just basically to restart the web server. Oh no, actually no, I'm jumping ahead. If we go inside of the EA folder, we just simply need to copy my Django, help if I was actually doing a command, my Django, right to there, and from there into Apache 2 site enabled. So we'll copy that across so that it's inside of the Apache's sites enabled folder, so that when Apache starts up, it can look through there and see what available sites are there and configured for it to serve. Okay, so once you've done that, we're pretty much ready to start things. At this point, we probably should also make sure that we deal with the requirements.txt. So to make sure that we've got these modules in before we go ahead and restart this Apache server, we do the following. So we do pip install -r requirements.txt, and that will then go away and get all of the modules that we've been using locally and install them onto the server so that it's inside of this virtual environment. So to start it off, we need to restart Apache 2, and we want to do service Apache 2 restart. That will restart the server, and hopefully you should see this OK bit here in white. If you don't, and you should see a fail in red, and if that's the case, you need to start and look at some of the configuration files. If you are having problems, it's often helpful, and if you've done other web services with Apache, it's often helpful. Actually no, wrong folder. var log Apache 2 error log. So it's often helpful just to watch through the error logs. Now you can see there from here there's been a shutdown message sent to the server, and then it's come back up again. So that's when we did our restart of the Apache web server. So we can see everything's fine in there. If this had failed, you would probably see some messages in here just to see that, you know, there's something else needs sorting out. So once that's done, it should be a case of us just simply visiting our website. So let's visit the website. Lo and behold, it works fine. Again, this is the same app that we did in the previous tutorial about email authentication, and we basically allow it to log in and register. And as you can see, it's serving everything off this fake domain that I created locally for my own testing. So that's pretty much the ins and outs of how to get something onto EC2. The configuration side of things is by far the most complicated part of the task. The last part, which is, you know, putting your Django code on, it might seem that that's the simplest part of it, and to be fair, it is. It's a bit of a nightmare doing system ops yourself if you're a web developer, but if you're smart, then you might, you know, consider using something a little bit less high intensity, like Heroku or some other different service. If not, and you're very lucky and you've got a system administrator, then feel free to do that, because that would be awesome if you've got somebody to work alongside with and help you to set up these complex things. Okay, well, that's the end of this tutorial, and if you've got any questions, then feel free to email me at hibbert.michael@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to help you out and see if we can get you through this and help you to learn a bit more about getting your stuff online. Okay, thanks for watching.